Thanks. So I'm just going to have a few slides here. So I'm going to skip over a few of this deck because I've got way too many slides to get over in about five or so minutes. So I'm just going to address a few points on batteries and what we call the electric revolution. So first of all, key point I think for EV adoption, what's driving EV adoption? In the short term, there's clearly a lot of government subsidies, a lot of various incentives around the world. That's clearly come under a little bit of pressure in China recently. But long term, I think the main driver of EV adoption is actually going to be economics. EV economics keep getting better, and that's powered by cheaper and better batteries. And so when you look at the cost of a powertrain, which is the top chart here, you can see the cost of an EV powertrain. This is a 60 kilowatt hour battery pack, which is something around 400 kilometers range or so, compared to combustion engine powertrain. The combustion engine powertrain keeps getting more expensive due to regulatory concerns, fuel emissions, miles per gallon, etc. And EVs keep getting cheaper as battery costs keep coming down. And so the crossover is inevitable. We think it's going to happen in the next few years. And if you look at the running costs below, that's in addition to that. So in addition to the economics of the vehicle up front getting closer, running costs for EVs are much cheaper than combustion engines. You save something like $700–800 per year running costs for an EV versus a combustion engine. So this is going to lead. This is really going to lead to an inflection point in mass adoption. And so, longer term, we think there's going to be potential bottleneck in batteries because the demand for batteries, which is this red line that curves up to the top right there. We think that's going to exceed our various supply assumptions for the industry, because although there's a lot of many battery suppliers, in terms of tier 1 quality battery suppliers, there's only 5, 6, or maybe 7. And so when you look at that and you look at the quality battery suppliers, we think there's going to be limited in a potential supply bottleneck post 2025. Touching on some of the technologies, I think we might talk about this more in the panel, but essentially solid-state battery is long-term trend. The moment major trend is moving towards higher nickel and lower cobalt. This is what we call Gen 2, lithium-ion plus, different types of cathodes with higher energy density driven by higher nickel, lower cobalt. That also saves costs because nickel is cheaper than cobalt. But longer term, again, solid state is very much the direction that a lot of these companies are focusing on. But it's not really going to be a major part of the market for probably another, at least for car batteries, for electric vehicles, probably for another 10 years or more. I'm going to skip that. Some of the different chemistries, so I talked about the different ratios of nickel and cobalt. So the left part of this chart, the laser's a bit weak, but you can see on the left-hand side the ratios of nickel, manganese, and cobalt, and essentially the nickel ratio is going up, cobalt ratio is going down, and you can see on the right that's driving a higher energy density. That is generally the trend right now. There are a few other things potentially coming in the next few years, but that's the main trend we're seeing. I'm going to skip some of this other stuff here. I think. Oh, last slide I want to point out, which I think is relevant to the long term, which is people ask, and there's still people that kind of have a doubt if an EV is really cleaner when you look at all the way from what they call well-to-wheel emissions. And so we looked at that for electric vehicles versus combustion engines. And I think it's pretty clear that although some of the electric vehicles in some of the countries, may not be that great. Like if you were to build an electric vehicle in China and drive it in China, you've got quite a lot of coal power there. But on average, electric vehicles, even with the average power mix around the world, much, much cleaner than combustion engines. And the direction is going to continue to get cleaner and cleaner. And also compared to fuel cells, electric vehicles are also better for the environment as well. And I think that's about it.
All right, thank you, Mark. I guess to start off, do any of our panelists want to kind of comment on any of the stuff that Mark talked about in his presentation, or should we just get on with some of our planned questions? Okay. So one of the things that you brought up was talking about kind of the chemical composition in batteries. What do you think, where are the trends leading? Do we want to kind of go through the panel and talk about where you think the batteries are headed and which metals you should be looking out for?
I think I already gave some of my views about, more nickel, less cobalt. Of course, because of the adoption of batteries, you also need more cobalt as well, because there's lots more batteries that are being made. But in general, that is the trend. And any other, maybe I'll pass over to my colleagues here.
Yeah, I guess I'll hop in. I mean, my take on it, Amy, is it really depends on what the drivetrain ultimately looks like. We haven't achieved a point, and certainly in the conversations I've had with car companies, whether they be in the Western world or in China, we haven't achieved the point where that's really been decided. We've been chasing, as I mentioned in my presentation, we've been chasing a regulatory requirement for a very long time that we move towards zero-emission vehicles, and obviously the car companies, when they were presented with that requirement, looked at whether they were going to do fuel cells or batteries, and it was pretty easy choice at the time, because to put fuel cells into commercial use, you probably would have to have won 3 Nobel Prizes in about the space of a year to have done it successfully, and that wasn't going to happen. So it was batteries, and obviously it was lithium batteries, because we tried lead acid at one point, and that was a dismal failure. So as much as people in California and in Hollywood tried to convince us, who killed the electric car, all the rest of it, the electric car at that point killed the electric car. It was a pretty simple operation. So if we move towards an environment where the energy requirement is the biggest requirement for the battery in a battery electric vehicle, then obviously we're still requiring nickel, we're still requiring some cobalt for stability. Advanced chemistries, advanced new cathode material manufacturing techniques aside, those are probably the drivers. If we move towards a requirement where you need power rather than just energy, well then that starts to open things up in some interesting directions. Maybe you can look at using lithium iron phosphate. Maybe you can look at using spinels, especially high voltage spinels. Those sorts of things change the landscape a bit, but it's still early days.
Cormac?
Yeah, I agree with John, and also with Mark. I think it's high nickel in the immediate future. It was even somewhat of a surprise that 811 entered the market this year. CATL were so aggressive, and it kind of showed the Chinese were trying to take the bull by the horns and lead the way in what's happening with the future of lithium-ion battery chemistry. The Koreans held back a little bit, but CATL paid a little price there because there was a few incidences in China where there was some smoke and fire. And so it's just showing that just rush a new battery technology into the market just to take the lead and appease some certain government policies towards further ranges, electric vehicle ranges, is dangerous and or can be dangerous. But they learned a lot of lessons from introducing these batteries into the field already, and it hasn't stopped them from tackling the issue and bringing it forward. But nickel is the big talk at the moment. We used to be cobalt, and I think Mark showed in a slide there that, you know, and John mentioned spinels, so manganese oxide type materials. After the subsidies are removed, there's no incentive really to go for the further ranges and the more, might be termed, more dangerous compositions of NMC. So, as John said, it's still very early to see, but each battery chemistry has its own specific domain that it can operate within, as iron phosphate for buses, LMO, or iron phosphate for power tools, and so on. So each, you know, it's carts for horses, or horses for carts. Each chemistry will have its own need, and depending which market and vehicle size grows, is it urbanization? Is it urban vehicles? Is it California highway, the Pacific Coast Highway type vehicles? I don't think it's going to be that, but yeah, I think, but in immediate future, nickel is what to look out for. Sorry, David. Yeah.
Thanks. I guess I have the fortune of going last. I guess I would echo the sentiments of the other panelists in saying I definitely see a lot of movement away from cobalt, maybe not just from the pricing reasons, but also, you know, the concentration risk around most of the cobalt supply coming out of the DRC, and a lot of the Western groups wanting to be non-reliant on DRC-sourced material. I think it also depends largely on your investment horizon. We're on the cusp of launching a technology minerals-focused funds, and, you know, quite frankly, we don't see major shifts in the technology that's coming online and the capacity that's being built over the next few years. So we're not taking a super long-term view on this, so we're kind of sticking with the usual suspects.
So a lot of you have brought up kind of the regulatory concerns, kind of pushing the drive for EVs, and with China having recently withdrawn some of its funding from EVs, what do you think kind of is going to happen to the market moving forward?
Yeah, so I think maybe I'll start. Yeah, clearly demand in China is a lot weaker than earlier expected. So the first half of this year, EV demand in China grew by about 60% year on year. I think early in this year, consensus was you'd get something like 20% plus growth this year. There was about 1.2 million EVs sold in China alone last year. So expectation was something like 1.5 million or so this year. But I think now expectations are probably roughly flat. Even some of the OEMs are openly saying could be actually probably down for the full year. And so that implies second half of this year is down, you know, 25-30% year on year. So it's quite a significant slowdown, and that's because of the reduction in the subsidies that started end of June this year. So clearly is having quite a big impact. I mean, my view on this is that there's lots of other tools in the toolbox that China government has. It's not just subsidies. You know, I think the government has done a pretty remarkable job really in you know, encouraging growth in the country. And I wouldn't really want to bet against them. So I don't think they're going to, I can't see any major change from the China government in terms of giving up on EVs. And so other things they could do to spur demand could be, you know, relaxing the restrictions on license plates for electric vehicles, for example. You've got these EV credits and CAFC rules that are being enforced, and those are getting harsher and harsher. So I still think adoption will continue to increase in China. It's just, you know, it needs, this policies continuously being tweaked, and arguably they may have over-subsidized it before, and now maybe they cut back maybe a little bit too quickly, and so they probably have to recorrect somehow next year.
John, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I mean, I just add that we have to keep things in context. The overall new vehicle market in China has slid considerably through this year. I mean, it's probably down more to general economic concern than, as I said earlier, to any market saturation or any other particular effect. New energy vehicles are still outselling, you know, in terms of growth, the older internal combustion vehicles, at least in light duty type vehicles by a considerable edge. So I'm not frightened about it. I think if you're going to see incentives being put in place and licensing restrictions, you know, being eased to some degree, you're probably going to see that for both internal combustion vehicles and new energy vehicles in China, because obviously still the bulk of vehicles being sold, the bulk of employment in China in the automotive industry is in the internal combustion side. So it won't be if it's an economic effect, it's likely something that the authorities will address across the entire automotive industry rather than just concentrating on new energy vehicles.
Yes, I think government policy, we've been saying it for years really, that it's the government policies, not just China. Europe, more recently, US has been dragged along a little bit, and UK. We wanted to know, could this industry stand on its own 2 feet? Didn't realize this was going to be the year it was going to be tested, 2019, but we knew there was going to be subsidy changes. We didn't know they were going to be so severe. But as Mark was talking about, the automotive credits out of China, we will also keep the market going, keep it tipping over. So it's for EV credits, doesn't have to be for long-range 811 type vehicles, and there's a secondary market for trading those credits when it occurs. The UK government just announced recently they're going to invest £1 billion in supply chains to kick off the British EV and battery making industries. You need governments behind you with big money and deep pockets, or else you won't get the investment from the outside. It has to be government, and we've seen the same in Germany and the EU also. So the government, this is one of those markets where the governments have to wrap their hands around it, where the US is more of an oil interest country and controls basically the global oil supply, has been a bit more standoffish. Even though, as we saw with 2 of the Nobel Prize winners are from the US, they did a lot of the big work in lithium-ion battery research, which Tesla capitalized being in US because it was right next to Berkeley National Labs, where a lot of this work is done in Silicon Valley. And so the US also needs to get going with the subsidies. They're not very generous. They're capped. GM, Tesla have already ran over the subsidy allowances last year, end of 2018. So it just remains to be seen. Is this a real market? Do consumers really want it? It's, down in Chile this week, they're protesting over increasing MTR fares, and deadly protests, people dying on the streets. French weren't too appreciative last year of the increase in duty tax on diesel. So once you start ramming EVs down people's throats, who knows what's going to happen? But take over there, David. Yeah, sorry.
I guess my comments would be, it's an unfortunate circumstance that, when the subsidies kind of elapse, that you have these major macroeconomic headwinds, which I think amplified the results. But, I've been in China long enough to see that, if the government sticks its mind to something, they're going to create the results and they're going to create the shift. I think what you're also seeing is, changing from a carrot to a stick now. And so we're going to look at a lot more regulatory, pressure to make shifts, the automotive credits, even, the city-by-city regulations that are going to dramatically affect the type of vehicles that people are purchasing. But let's not forget, if we're talking about EVs, we're talking about China. They're responsible for 60+%, of the electric vehicles sold right now. They are responsible for 60 to 70% of, the gigafactories for the foreseeable 10 years, and they are responsible for the largest amount of, battery precursors than any other country in the world. So I don't see this trend going anywhere.
Going back to kind of looking at governments, do you think that they are taking a growing role in funding the kind of projects necessary to, for the battery metals themselves. Is China getting involved in funding these types of projects to kind of push for?
I mean, personally, I don't know about domestically in China, but I can tell you that most of the SOEs that we've been speaking to still don't have a view on it and still take an incredibly conservative outlook over this very new landscape with a geography that's changing day by day. As many of the panelists have commented, we're still in the early days. I think we still haven't had agreement on size of battery, chemistry of battery, what the key elements are, and so you're not going to see a lot of state actors base their careers on some very critical decisions in the space.
Yeah, the US are trying to rush through some legislation for what they call energy mineral security. So and there will be a fund set up, so it'll be easier to develop in the domestic supplies of certain battery materials and minerals in the US. And outside that also, they're going to various other countries in South America offering to guide previously established businesses and lithium producers on how to mine and sell sustainably, which is the big word for battery production. If you're not carbon neutral and sustainable, there's a good chance the high-value OEMs in Europe won't buy your products. BMW said recently they're not going to buy any DRC Cobalt, but kind of step back a little bit from that statement when they realized it's going to be a lot more difficult. So yeah, governments, as the US, really want to, are making steps now to control their own supply chain and not be, not vulnerable to the whims of China, who control most of the lithium battery metal supply and precursors.
Maybe as the only American on the panel, I'll make a couple of comments. I think the United States has been asleep on this issue for a very, very long time. I think the Chinese have been long-term thinkers, very strategic, and have built up, the entire value chain and supply chain, have looked overseas for strategic sources of supply, and trying to leapfrog all of that work is going to be very difficult for the United States. And everything I've seen, even in the most recent, escalation around rare earths, is that the U.S. is causing a lot of noise and, creating a lot of motion, but there's been very little progress on the front.
I sat on a panel years ago, Dave. It was at Stanford, and they called in a bunch of different people from different aspects of the critical materials community to come in and comment on the U.S. government, the first U.S. Department of Energy report on critical materials that was done back in 2010 or whatever it was. And we were sitting there, and we'd gone through 2 days of meetings and discussion, and people had been diligently taking notes and everything else. And I finally, they came around and said, well, what did you make of these 2 days? And everybody was waxing eloquent about what a great breakthrough it was that we had industry and and academia and all of these people, communicating with one another. And I said, I think we wasted 2 days. And they basically said, why? And I said, because there's no indication that the government is going to push in any direction to solve these issues around availability of this material or that material or that material. And one of the guys in academia stood up and looked at me and said, but John, it's not our job to pick the winners. And I said, so by definition, we're to pick the losers then? And the answer was kind of, yeah. I mean, it was such a laissez-faire attitude towards moving things forward. Whereas in China, what you see is the government, the various authorities at different levels will get involved, and they will say, listen, we think this is a valuable direction to move. This is part of a 5-year plan. This is part of a 25-year plan. We're going to
put budget to work.
This. And they put budget to work. And you know what? Until Western governments start to do exactly that, we will remain behind and deserve to be behind.
Yeah, I mean, what I can say from the U.S. side is, they found whatever guy was responsible at the State Department, pulled him out of his windowless office, had him go around and call up a bunch of these rare earths companies, and there's absolutely no progress. So until somebody's willing to raise their hand, take the burden onto their shoulders and get a budget allocated towards them, it's going to be status quo.
I think now's a good time to see if we have any questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, panel speakers. So we've talked about the battery technology as well as the policies in China and US. Just want to take a longer term view and see, apart from China, where do you see is the next in Asia? Because we've seen the policies like in India or Indonesia, they all say like in longer term, they also want to build a lot of electric vehicles. So just want to take, ask about your view of that.
Yeah, I've been working in the battery industry in China for the last 7 years, but recently I've been going to India and working with a lot of Chinese manufacturers going to India. And there's a lot of Indian guys companies trying to set up, but a lot of Chinese manufacturers are pouring into India at the moment. And so I don't have any production values. I'd say it's quite low, you know, not even a gigawatt probably. But I think they'll ramp up quite quick. They'll have the Chinese expertise of getting the large battery production factories running in, you know, 18 months, 2 years kind of time frame, which is quite quick. But they have their own issues there with power and health and safety and a few other things. But a lot of noise coming out of India in my particular field anyway.
I'd have to say that I think China has a unique opportunity in the space because they have successfully incented the production of so many new energy vehicles. To a degree, they've made a mistake, I think, in that they've tried to follow the United States model. They've tried to incent larger, more energy-dense batteries into a market that there is a fair bit of evidence to support the idea that is not prepared to pay for those larger, more energy-dense batteries. And similarly, it could be argued the buyers in Indonesia, Malaysia, and India are not able or willing to pay for larger, more energy-dense batteries. So one would think if there's any trend, it's going to be that it's the Chinese car companies that are probably going to be making the export models that go into those newly emerging markets. And it's largely the Chinese type of vehicle, be that a very small city car with a relatively small battery and limited range, some sort of serial hybrid design, something, you know, Karma, you know, and others are building serial hybrids, and they are Chinese companies. Effectively, they're owned by Chinese groups. I think that's probably the most interesting trend, that the United States and Western car manufacturers are concentrating on pickup trucks and SUVs, whereas a good chunk of the rest of the world wants something that's cheap and that actually keeps you dry in a rainstorm. You know, that dichotomy is going to be a very, very interesting one to follow over the next 15 or 20 years.
Right, yeah, and I think on that, I mean, you look at the India market, Cormac was just mentioning, that is an interesting market because I think there's a lot of growth there, but it's a little bit less from passenger vehicles, and I think there's a lot of growth from micro-mobility, bikes, tuk-tuks, you know, two-wheelers, three-wheelers, etc. Plus also some of the energy storage systems for backup because of all the grid issues that they have, and telecom base stations. I think I heard from somebody in India that the telecom base stations, if you use a lead-acid battery in a telecom base station in India, because of the cycling, it cycles on average about more than once a day because of the there's some kind of power outage very, very frequently, and so they run out they don't even last a year many times, and so lithium-ion is a big, big improvement in that. So I think that is one huge market that is only just starting now, I think, India.
Yep, we can take another question.
Thanks, David, this may be directed to you, or perhaps John as well. We're getting a lot of funding opportunities across, you know, graphite, lithium, nickel, and cobalt. Now, everyone who's outside of the DRC will, you know, pour doom and gloom over the DRC, but a lot of people we're speaking to where that supply is coming from are saying, no, blockchain should solve it because you have the traceability. De Beers did it originally with etching diamonds, and now all these gemstones, etc.
These critical materials won't contain much nickel, won't contain much cobalt, and frankly, for the automotive industry, that's okay, that's a good thing. If people are willing to buy those, sell them all day long.
The thing about cobalt I don't understand is that all your phones and laptops have lithium cobalt oxide for the last 20-something years, and no one said a word about where that cobalt is. And Apple, or there was a few things about 5 years ago, but they basically slide by, Samsung slid by, no one's saying anything about it. And they're still using it and won't be changing it anytime soon. But I'm slightly worried about cobalt because if you remember recently there was the million-mile Tesla test that was done from Jeff Dan, who invented the NMC material. And he cycled a battery from 5 years ago, and it went a million kilometers, I should say. But he did another paper called Do We Really Need Cobalt? So he made the same NMC type materials, but with just no cobalt and extra nickel and a little bit more lithium rich maybe, and they cycled better. So he just made very close materials to NMC with the traditional cobalt, 2 parts, or even 2 parts are the 111, and they cycled okay, or fine, better he said, but he's got a bit of an agenda. And Tesla recently, their latest Model 3, so they had NCA, and it was about 0.8 parts nickel, 0.15 parts cobalt. They're guessing it's 0.05 cobalt in there at the moment. So almost no cobalt left in the NCA type materials, but haven't seen the work, but that's the thought.
When we use shorthand, I just want everybody here to understand, when we use shorthand like Jeff Don and Tesla did a test and they showed a 1,000,000-mile battery, just understand it was a really artificial test. Yeah. Okay, so Cormac and I would probably tear that thing apart for about 2 hours up here. Issues like, if you're going to do a bunch of cycles on a battery which are constant drain at a controlled temperature, let's try highly variable drains at, 42 degrees Celsius, followed by freezing the battery, followed by 42 Celsius, and see what happens to those chemistries as they go through this test. I mean, we just don't know enough about that sort of thing to say whether we're going to be able to get rid of particular materials or move to particular chemistries at all.
All right, I think we had one more question from the back.
Just, I think it's the last question. You're going to wrap up. If you had to choose between cobalt and nickel, looking maybe 7 years down the road, and you had to make a gamble, would you say it's going to be a cobalt world or a nickel world?
That's a good way to wrap this up, I think.
Each one of you, can you tell me what you feel?
I think my presentation at the beginning, I definitely would pick nickel out of the two. But I think some of the other comments are relevant here. I think, John, you mentioned about LFP and some of these other chemistries. It's not just those two elements. There are lots of other things that are being worked on, spinol, which is manganese. These types of different ratios, I think they're going to continuously evolve. And I completely agree with your comment earlier about LFP potentially coming, it is actually coming back. One of BYD's new factories is LFP chemistry. It doesn't have any nickel, doesn't have any cobalt. Yes, it's slightly lower energy density, but they can get to 161 hours per kilogram pack-based energy density now, which is much better than we thought was possible. So maybe it's neither. Maybe it's neither nickel nor cobalt.
I guess I get to go next. I think, Keith, if I had to choose, I would probably take cobalt. I think the energy density. Step back for half a second. So energy density is an issue if you're running a battery electric vehicle. We say electric vehicle for shorthand, but it's really the only energy source on that vehicle is a battery. Energy density then is a major concern. But as we solve and get past the issue of how many zero-emission vehicles truly need to be built, the automotive industry then settles on the matter of trying to build those other vehicles for as little money as possible. So as you move away from an energy density question towards a power question and towards the energy being supplied by another means, or maybe you're looking at vehicles that are being sold in China, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, as being acceptable if they only have 100 kilometers range or 150 kilometers range, then you can start to look towards other materials to fill that gap. You don't need nickel for energy density anymore. You don't need cobalt for stability. You can get by without it. Whereas the reason I would pick cobalt then would be there are other uses out there. You know, we talk about batteries, we talk about electric vehicles here, but cobalt has other perfectly good uses and is a relatively rare material, and those other uses are growing over time, both for superalloys, for jet turbine blades and the like. So, you know, there's a number of other uses there that will drive cobalt forward, including continued use in electronics and all of the rest. I'm hopeful that neither one of them becomes a real bottleneck over the next 4 or 5 years. But you know, if I had to guess, I would say it's likelier to be cobalt over that time frame.
Yeah, tricky question, all right. But I think John showed the future in one of his, or Mark showed the future in one of his slides. It was lithium air. The producers want to not pay for any nickel or cobalt. They want it free. So the goal is to drive down costs. So air is the ultimate goal. We're very far away from that. But I would agree with John that cobalt is still going to be around, and it's still going to have a specific purpose in the electrification of the world, really, not just EVs. You get the aerospace, marine, maritime sector. It's going to have plenty of uses where for the urbanization, the LFP, that's different applications. But there's going to be room for the NMC. And another reason I say cobalt, because a few years ago I was working with a nickel mining company and a different battery material project, and they have great nickel project themselves, and it never occurred to them that you know, this nickel could be, you know, used in battery applications, and now the last 6 months or so it's nickel, 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 and these guys are calling me up. What can we do? What can we do? So, but I think the nickel will be saturated because it already existed, and cobalt will still have. For me.
I mean, I guess looking at it from an investment point of view, I think, you know, the amount of nickel used in batteries right now is pretty minuscule, and even if it grows significantly, it's still, you know, going to be limited. There's a lot more nickel than there is cobalt, so and the uses of cobalt are diverse, and its value in those applications is extremely high. So for something with great value and limited supply, I'd put my money on cobalt.
Great, thank you. So that pretty much wraps up this panel and the first day of the one-to-one mining investment event in Hong Kong. So big round of applause for our panelists today. And so we will